Hello guys, and welcome back to my YouTube video. So in this video we are going to be talking about Docker. Okay, so basically what is Docker? So Docker is a tool, open source tool, that helps developers to build, share, run and verify applications anywhere without tedious environment configuration or management, right? So think of it this way, right? You are this guy right here, you're a solo developer, you are working on a backend, right? And then once you're done with your backend, you don't have to bother about anyone because you're working alone. So just deploy it, right? You just make sure maybe you deploy it on AWS or something. But think of these guys now. These guys are a team, right? So imagine this guy right here is building a backend. They are all building a backend. But this guy right here is working on some features, let's say on Windows, right? And then he then forwards, let's say, the backend to this guy right here. This guy is using Mac. But when this guy tries to run the same code base that this guy was working on, he's getting dependency issues, right? And also this guy also is also getting maybe dependency issues, maybe he's running Linux or something like that. You get, so now the problem now we're having is it's now a dependency issue. These guys are now spending more time dealing with dependencies instead of focusing on the real project, right? On solving problems, right? Now that's where Docker comes in. So Docker now allows you to build, right, applications, and then if you Dockerize those applications, you can just Dockerize it maybe, and then you send it to this guy. This guy uses Docker to run that application. Now they don't have to deal with dependencies since they are using what standardized, standardized images, right? That can work across all platforms, right? So now, while it's just still on Docker, let's talk about the container, right? So what is a container when it comes to Docker, right? So a container, just think of it as an isolated process for each of your app's component, right? For example, each component, let's say, for example, the React frontend, the Python API engine, and the database, they have their own isolated environment and they are completely isolated from everything else on the machine, right? So think of it this way: we're building an Express.js application. That Express.js application, what, it depends on MongoDB, right? So think of this component. It's just like these are isolated process for what, for app, right? So that means that we have a container for our Express.js application, and then container for what? We have a container for our MongoDB, right? And then let's talk about an image, right? So before we dive into an image, you need to know that an image runs in a container, right? It's more of like an image is a blueprint for a container, right? So a container is a standardized package that includes all files, binaries, libraries, and configurations to run in a container. So remember, we're talking about those guys having dependency issues, right? So since we have our container, right? Our container, we have an image. Let's say this image is going to be like all the files that we need to run, let's say, Express.js application. So to run an Express.js application, what do you need? Node.js, right? So our image is going to have like Node.js. That Node.js is going to be standardized, right? For example, Node.js 19, right? It's going to run what inside our container, right? It's going to have like all the ingredients that we need for us to run our Express.js application. So that's basically what an image is, right? Now let's talk about volume, right, in Docker. So a volume is just a mechanism for persisting and sharing data by and used by Docker containers, right? So just know that Docker containers use volumes for persisting and sharing data, right? And know that a volume is not stored inside the container. It's stored on the host machine, not on the container, but on the host machine, separate from the container. So this makes it easier for us when the container is deleted or recreated. Okay, so that makes it faster, right? So basically, you need to know that a volume is just used for storing databases, for example, Postgres, SQL, sharing files between containers, right? For example, if we are working on a project, right, and then let's say an Express.js application, it runs using Node.js, right? We have a container for our Node.js application. Then we have our container for our database, right? A volume simply allows us to share the files between those containers, right? And then let's talk about a register, right? Register versus repository. So just know that a register is a centralized location that stores and manages container images, right? So we have public register where you can find containers, right? For example, Docker Hub is a public register that you can go and then fetch, let's say, Node.js 19, right? Whereas a repository is just a collection of related container images, right? It's just a collection of what? Of related container images within a register, right? So a Docker register just stores Docker images, right? So as I talked about, Docker Hub is a public register that anyone can use, right? So now that we have talked about Docker, the next thing that we need to do is, before we go any further, is we need to download Docker, right? How to download Docker and then how to set it up, right? So what I'm simply going to do is just going to pull up my browser right here, right? So what you simply have to do is go on Google and then just type download Docker, right? So once you say download Docker, you can choose what operating system you're using, right? For me, I'm using for Mac, right? So I'll just download it for Mac. I'll just cancel it since I've already downloaded it and then I already have it on my machine, right? So once you have done with the installation process, this is the interface that you get, right? Docker desktop, right? So first we have the containers, right? Containers, this will display all your containers, all the containers that we have that are running, right? And then we have the images, right? As you can see, I already have some images here. And then we have volumes, right? And then also builds, right? To show you the builds that we have made, right? And then we have Docker Hub. If you still remember, I talked about Docker Hub right here, which is a registry for what? Which is just a registry for storing Docker images, right? In this case, this is public, right? So as you can see, we have these images right here. As you can see, this is Node.js right there. So you can just pull it, right? So you can just pull it, and you can even use like a terminal to just run Docker. So we have this terminal right here. So I'm just going to talk about a few Docker commands that we can use, right? So let's just wait for the terminal to just finish building, right? Or let me just pull up my terminal on my machine right there, right? So now let's go back to Docker commands, right? So we have these Docker commands, right? So we have this Docker run to run an image, right? So let's say, for example, let me just copy it. And then let's go to my Mac, right? So I'm just going to paste it, but I want to run this image right here. So we have this, as you can see, we have this Docker image. So let's copy it, this node that we pulled from Docker Hub. So if I want to run it, I can simply go to Docker run, and then I paste the Docker image, right? As you can see, Docker run right there. It's already it's already running, right? We can also run this one right there. We can also run this one, right? So I'll simply say Docker run, and then I paste in and then I paste in the Docker image. So in this case, we have Mongo. So it's saying unable to, as you can see now, the Mongo is now is now running, as you can see, right? And then the other command that we have is Docker ls, right? So let me just stop this process, right? The other command that we have is Docker ls, right? Docker ps. So this command right here, it shows us all the list of running the list of running containers, right? Docker PS. So if we go to our Docker Hub, let's go to Docker Hub right here, and then let me paste it. As you can see, we have this container right here, job board app right there, and then we have this Mongo. As you can see, let's go to our containers. Let's try to see if they exist here. Job search and then MongoDB. As you can see, those are our containers that we have right there, right? And then we can also do the same for our Docker images, right? So let me go back to our Docker, and then let's Docker images. As you can see, that's the images that we have with mod, node, and then job search backend. Those are the images that we have, right? And then the other one is you can use this one. You can also use this one, right, to pull in images, for example, from Docker Hub, right? So let's just say Docker pull, and then let's just say node. Let's see. As you can see, we already have node, so it's not going to do that. But we can also do it. For example, let's pull a Python image. Python, right? As you can see, it's done pulling Python image from Docker Hub. If we go to our to our images, you can see now we have the Python, right? And then we also have Docker build, right? So this one, it allows us to build an image from Dockerfile. In this case, we don't have a Dockerfile, right? So we can also use Docker stop to just to stop a container from running, right? So let's do it right here. Let's paste the command, and then let's copy our container name right there. So let's stop MongoDB, right? As you can see, we have stopped this container right there, right? We have stopped the container from running, right? So now we also have another one to start a container, right? The docker start command, and then docker rm to remove a container, and then this one, the docker rmi to remove the image. So all these other Docker containers, I'm not going to talk about them. You can simply play around with them, experiment with them, and then see how they work, right? So now that we have learned what is Docker, we are now familiar with what is Docker, right? Now we are simply going to Dockerize our Express.js application, right? Use into practice, right? So here I have a Express.js application. So this application is a job board application, right? So what basically does, it allows companies to post vacancies and also for applicants to apply for vacancies, right? As you can see, we have the model middleware controller and then config. I'm not going to cover how this works, right? If you want to know how to build a backend like this, check out my backend series, right? I have a backend series, right? So in this video, we're only going to be talking about Docker, right? So to create a Docker container, what we are simply going to do is, you simply, inside the root folder of our project, we are just going to create a Docker file, right? A Docker file, right? So now that we have created a Docker file, what we are simply going to do is, we are simply going to type in this command from node 19. So since you know that Docker uses Node.js, right? So we are simply telling Node.js that we want node 19 as our image, right? If you hover your cursor there, you can see that it's telling us that the image has 12 critical and 90 vulnerabilities, right? So you can also go on Docker Hub and check other versions of Node, and then you can then use them, right? And then the next thing that we need to do is, we need to set up a working directory for our for our Docker container, right? So the working directory for a Docker container, so that's where our image is going to be, and that's where our application is going to be running, right, inside the app directory, right? So if you see however set the working directory for any subsequent, right, so that that's where we'll add copy, or all the commands will be running, right? So now that we have set out our working directory, the next thing that we simply need to do is we are simply going to copy the package JSON, right? We are simply going to copy the package.json, right? Where are we copying it? We are copying it inside our app folder, our working directory right there. So as you can see, copy files or folders from source to the destination path in the image file system. So as you can see, we say package asterisk y, because we have the package.json and also package.log. If we also add another package, it's going to copy it inside inside our working directory right there. All right. So now the next is we are going to tell our container what to run npm install. So what simply this will do is npm install will simply install node modules, right? These node modules right there, right? Inside our container, right? So now that we are done, the next thing that we need to do is we need to copy our source code, right? We need to copy our source code, right? All the files in our system. So we are simply going to copy all these other files, right? The config, controller, middleware, mod, routes, uploads, right? We are simply going to copy them from our source folder. This is our source folder, to where we are going to copy them inside our working directory like this, right? And then once we are done with this, the next thing is we need to expose our container, right? We need to expose our expose our container to our port on our machine, right? On our local machine, right? So we are going to expose it on port 6013, right? So it means that it's going to be running on 6013 on our port right there, right? And then now we simply going to declare executable commands that our container must run, right? So the first one is going to be npm, right? The first one is going to be npm, and then npm npm start, right? Npm and then start, right? So now that we are done with our Dockerfile, right there, we are done with our Dockerfile, right? So what we can simply do is, if we want, we can simply build this into a Docker command, right? So you can simply, let's look for Docker container build command right there, right? So let's try this one. Since we already declared our Docker file right there, right? So I'm simply going to stop my terminal. I was running other things there, right? So what I'm simply going to do is I'm simply going to use this Docker build. As you can see, now it's building, right? And you can see also these commands that we used here. You can see copy and then exporting image, right? And then if we go inside our Docker container right there, right? Let's go inside our Docker, and then let's go to images, right? And then let's go to images. As you can see, this is the container that we built 17 seconds ago. It doesn't have a name because we used the .tech, right? So if we go to, it doesn't have a name, right? But if you want, you can just put a tag right there. You can just put a tag right there. You can go out and try these commands, right? So now that we have built our Docker container right here, we have a problem. We have a slight problem, right? As you can see, this is our Express.js application. So as you can see, this Express.js application, it uses MongoDB as our database. As you can see, right? It uses MongoDB as our database, right? So now, since it uses MongoDB as our database, right? So as you can see, only a container is supposed to run only one image, right? So the logical thing that we'll do is would maybe create another Docker file and then run maybe Node.js, MongoDB in a separate container, and then we'll build those containers separately, and then maybe we'll try to find a way to link them so that they can work together. As you can see, it becomes messy, and also it makes it very difficult when we are deploying our application to platforms, cloud platforms such as DigitalOcean or AWS, right? So is there any way that we can like define two containers that depend on each other? Yes, that's where Docker Compose comes in, right? So you simply type Docker and then compose dot YML or YAML, or you can simply use YAML, right? So now Docker Compose, right? So now the first thing that we can do is we can just declare the version of Docker Compose. In this case, it's going to be version 3.8, right? It's going to be version 3.8. If you want, you can just leave it like that. The version doesn't matter, right? And then for our backend, right, we have two services, right? We have the Express.js application service, and then we also have the MongoDB service. It's more of like these two containers, right? So now let's declare services, right? So let's declare services. As you can see, the services that will be used by your application, right? So our application is going to use what? Express.js, and also what else? And then MongoDB, right? So the first service that our application is going to be using, we are just going to call it backend, right? That's backend service, right? And then after this, what we need to do is we are just going to build that service, right? Using the build command, right? We are simply going to build that service using the build command, right? And then after we do this, the next thing is we need to declare the container name for our service, right? The container name for our service. In this case, the container name for our service, I'm just going to call it the job board backend, right? Job board backend right there, right? And then the next thing that we need to do is we need to map the port of our container to the port on our machine, right? So to do that, we simply have to declare the ports, right? So in this case, we are going to map port 6013 on our container to port 6013 on our host machine, right? That is my laptop, right? And then the next thing is we are going to define an environment that this backend depends on, right? So environment, let's declare the environment. In this case, the environment is going to be the Mongo URL. If you go to our .env file, you can see we have this Mongo URL here. So what I'm simply going to do is I'm simply going to copy it, and then I'm simply going to paste it inside our Docker Compose, right? So now that we are done with our URL, the next thing that we need to declare is our volume, right? So the volumes, right? So you can just rewind a bit, and then you can understand what is a volume. I already explained it, right? So right, this is our volume right there, right, for our application. And then now the good thing about Docker Compose, since our Express.js depends on MongoDB as a database, now we don't have to run like two separate containers. We'll just run one. We don't have to declare two separate containers separately, right? Docker Compose allows us to build containers that depend on each other. Now what we simply do is this backend it depends on MongoDB, right? Which will be another service that would declare later on, right? So I'm just going to call it Mongo_DB, right? And then we need to say we need to declare restart, right? So yes, we are going to restart unless stopped, right? We are going to restart unless stopped, right? So now that we have declared our service, the first service is going to be the backend with the build function, container name, ports, environment, volumes, and then we have declared that it depends on MongoDB. So now let's create this service, MongoDB, right there, right? So let's declare this service MongoDB. This is going to be a service, right? And then we need an image for this service, right? So we need to declare the image, right? The image is going to be Mongo 6, right? This image right here, right? And then we need to declare also the container name. So the container name, we are simply going to call it MongoDB, right? And then we also need to map the port of our container to the port of our local machine, right? So we'll simply map using ports, right? In this case, our MongoDB is going to run on 27017. In our container, we are going to make it to 27017 on our PC, right? And then the next thing we also need is the volume, right? So the volumes, which is going to be, we're going to call it Mongo data, right? Mongo data /data and then /db, right? And then also we are going to restart also unless stopped. So we are going to restart unless it's stopped by the what? By the user, right? And then after this, right, we need to declare the volumes, right? Which is the volumes for our MongoDB, which is Mongo data. Like this, right? So now that we are done declaring our Docker compose, as you can see, now it makes the whole process easy. Simply, we are going to just declare 2 containers that depend on each other, right? The first one is going to be the job board backend, and then we declare that it depends on the MongoDB. As you can see, this is the MongoDB container right there. So after we do this to run these containers, now we simply have to use the Docker compose app --build command, right? So as you can see now, it's now building. As you can see, MongoDB pulling, it's now building these containers for us, right? As you can see. So we got an error, restart policy, unknown policy, unless started. So it's supposed to be unless stopped, right? Not started. So that's a typo right there. And then let's build it again. As you can see, now we are done building it. As you can see, even we are connected to our database, right? Now if I go to our MongoDB desktop right there, you can see containers. We have the MongoDB container right there. Containers, as you can see, job search backend. You can even go to view container usage, right? And you can see job search backend right there, right? So as you can see, now we have our containers, right? And then you can see it as Mongo 6 image, and then the backend, which is our Express.js application, right? So that's it, guys, on Docker. I hope this video, this crash course, will help you to get a better understanding of Docker and then how to Dockerize your applications, right? Thanks for watching, guys. Cheers.